맘의 숨이 씁니다.
Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of the Lions Led by Donkeys podcast. I'm Joe, and with me as always is Nick.
Me.
And we are on part 2 of the Winter War. Now, before we get started on part 2, we have to give a little shout out to our podcast co-host / friend of the show, Rich, for completely redesigning our studio.
Redesigning.
I mean, studio is I know it's a strong term, but it
sounds good.
She bought a whole bunch of desks and bookshelves and slapped them all together, as well as cleaned up our disgusting pigsty of a mess that we leave. I don't remember the last time we picked up beer bottles or cans in here, but I'm going to say a month.
Yeah.
She did all this for a Christmas present for the podcast, and bless her fucking heart, because she worked her ass off.
Yeah. But now we can't find anything.
Yeah, it's that unfortunate things. You've been living in your own shit pile for so long that once somebody I didn't mess it up, I simply organized, I knew where everything was. Yeah, that's exactly how I feel right now. So when we left you last week, the Soviet Union was rattling their giant hammer and sickle-shaped saber against their tiny neighbor Finland, who simply had the audacity to not want to be part of Russia again. Those fucking bastards. How dare you want freedom? Now, there's no question that the Soviet Union wanted to go to war. That's not what it's not like some conspiracy theory here of what their intentions were. What's more important than their desire to go to war is just how easy they thought the whole thing was going to be, which kind of explains why they were so eager to do it. Nobody's ever going to be super eager to do something that is really fucking hard.
Yeah.
It's like the same reason why chores that are around the house simply pile up, because that sounds like it's going to be difficult.
Yep.
Or maybe I'm just a lazy piece of shit. I don't know.
I usually save them for the last minute.
I mean, the same could be said for homework.
Oh, so true. I never did it.
Yeah. And so just to underline how easy the Soviet Union thought this whole thing was going to be, we go back to our boy Nikita Khrushchev, who was working in Soviet government at the time. And all right, so before we get into it, Nikita Khrushchev isn't obviously the biggest fan of Joseph Stalin. He was the architect of de-Stalinization after Joseph Stalin died. So obviously the man doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about Joseph Stalin. But in fairness, most people shouldn't.
Yeah, they should.
Most people shouldn't. He is a huge critic of Joseph Stalin, but he was one of the only people who has written openly about his time in Stalin's government critically. So we use him a lot when it comes to this. Also, he was there for all these meetings. So I use what I have, man.
Pretty good source.
Yeah. So he said, quote, "All we were going to have to do is raise our voices a bit, and the Finns would obey. And if that didn't work, we will simply fire a shot, and they'll put their hands up and surrender."
Bing, bang, boom. Done.
Yeah. Easy shit. Now, this kind of attitude is why Stalin did not put a whole lot of thought into the idea of a war against Finland. Soviet leadership were let into Stalin's apartment to kind of, I guess, workshop an idea. I guess it's hard to think of something going on in Stalin's apartment.
Stalin, hey, everybody, come over. Everybody's
he lives on lawn chairs and shit. He doesn't have real furniture.
Yeah.
It's hard to think of actual government policy being formed in some dude's apartment.
Everybody's waiting for the first guy to leave, so then everybody can start leaving.
Yeah. I gotta go see a guy.
Oh, come on.
Well, if he's everybody's gonna slowly trickle out. And Stalin's still wearing his field marshal jacket, but he's wearing boxers and flip flops,
or just socks.
I think we just, but socks with sandals,
Yeah.
because Stalin fucking wears socks with sandals. But they all had a meeting in Stalin's apartment to talk about military action against Finland, and Stalin was kind of in a jokey, jovial mood, or at least as jovial as fucking Joseph Stalin could be. Because I know there's pictures of him smiling, but thinking of him actually laughing is kind of weird. He's not a man who enjoyed things.
No.
He fucked with a scowl on his face. When he came, he just grimaced. So he wasn't really listening to the conversation to be all the other people are well, if we did this or we did that, coming up with plan A through C or whatever. He's not really listening to any of it. He just knows that he wants to go to war and fuck Finland up. So at the end of it, he kind of disregards everything everything everybody else was saying, and he said, "Let's just get started today. Like
What?
that's an actual quote. Like after hours of talking about this, Khrushchev said Stalin just kind of just shrugged his shoulders, like, "Well, let's just do it today."
I feel like he just put up a map and like put up a giant sticker and said, "Boom, right on Finland."
That's
it.
Just threw a fucking a dart. It's like, huh, guess it's Finland. After they pull the dart out of Poland.
Yeah.
So the officials in the room were kind of taken aback at the carefree attitude Stalin had towards the idea of going to war.
Well, they're in his apartment.
Yeah, they're in his fucking bachelor pad. But they weren't going to say anything about it because it's Joseph
I
Stalin.
wonder how the tour was, and he's giving everybody the tour.
I have a feeling you could see
It was
the
like
whole
MTV
thing from the
Cribs?
front door.
Oh, I thought he would think of like, "Hey guys, come on in. This is where the magic happens."
And you know, normally when we bring up people with really bad ideas, they either fall into like two camps, and that is they disregarded all opinions to the contrary, or they were simply like brutal dictators and nobody had the balls to say anything. Stalin kind of falls into both because people almost universally, even in writing, will be like, you know, we kind of tried to tell him this was a bad idea, but it's Joseph Stalin. He's not going to listen to anybody. But this was, like Khrushchev says, quote, "This was Stalin's idea. Naturally, I did not oppose him." Khrushchev is also like noted as being quoted as saying, like, when Joseph Stalin says dance, a wise man dances. Because that's something he actually fucking did.
Wow.
He used to have like booze ass parties at in like the Kremlin or like in his apartment or wherever, and he would be drinking water, and he would force everybody else to get drunk and dance for him.
Oh.
Yeah, like
Okay.
he just wanted them to be an ass.
I think he also told people not to grow a better mustache or anything like that.
Oh, God forbid you have a better mustache than Joseph
Oh, yeah.
Stalin. You're not only will you be purged, but so will your mustache.
Or own more than 12 tracksuits. Because as far that's
I don't think Stalin was a gopnik, though. An idea of a gopnik Stalin is admittedly fucking hilarious.
Yeah, he only had 12. If you had more than
He
12,
ju-
you're fucked.
He just wanted to squat on the entire world.
Yeah.
He wanted to redistribute squats so everybody could have a fair share amount of squats.
But honestly, dancing to Gopnik music looks entirely like too much fun.
Yeah, Stalin
It's just
isn't
like
about that. Stalin ain't about that shit. So the first shots of the war, or the first 7 shots to be exact, were fired on November 26th.
7?
Yep. November 26th, 1939. Now we know this because they were targeted at 3 Finnish observation posts who took notes about the whole thing and radioed it forward. And the soldiers manning them must have been pretty confused because these shots landed a full 800 meters short of them inside of Soviet territory. After that, nothing else happened. The firing stopped and it just kind of ended. It was like, that was weird.
Yeah, that'll show him.
You think we should tell the commander about that? Yeah, probably. I don't know. They shelled themselves, so
Yeah, pretty much.
So after that, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov sent an angry telegram to Helsinki, Finland. The telegram said that 4 Soviet soldiers had been killed after Finnish guns had shelled their position. Now, there's a problem with this for obvious reasons. 1, Finland didn't shell them, and 2, is literally impossible for the Finns to have shelled them. See, now Mannerheim had very few pieces of artillery at his disposal. And in order to preserve them in the case of any Soviet attack, he had actually withdrew them away from the border to preserve them from the initial Soviet blitzkrieg that he assumed would come over the border at any time. Am I saying that there's some kind of conspiracy here that the Soviets shelled themselves and probably really did kill 4 of their own
That's
people
what I was thinking.
to start a war against Finland? Yes. The reason why I say that is because Nikita Khrushchev fully admitted that's exactly what they did. He said the shots were set up by Marshal of Artillery and KVD agent Grigory Kulik. So and there is a paper trail to prove this.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I would love to think that they did it on accident. Like, oh fuck!
Like they were just drunk and fired off some rounds on accident. Now Kulik is an interesting guy, and by interesting guy I mean piece of shit sycophant. Like most people in the Soviet army at the time, he was raised to his position after the purges simply because he was a close personal friend of Joseph Stalin, and he was a yes man. He was so blindly loyal to Stalin that when his own wife was kidnapped and executed on Stalin's order, he didn't even worry about it. He was like, yeah, she probably sucked anyway.
Good, she sucked.
She was a bad communist. Please don't kill my kids. Yeah, it didn't even like slow him down. He was also an NKVD agent before he was a military officer, so he was a murderer, for lack of a better term. He murdered his way up the ladder.
Oh, that's good.
Now, obviously, Helsinki immediately denied that they were involved in these shellings whatsoever. They even sent them copies of Mannerheim's order to withdraw those artillery pieces from the border as proof. None of that mattered because you're not going to go through the hassle of launching quite literally a false flag attack and then not follow it up with a war. I mean, ask Vietnam. A few hours later, Helsinki would be on fire by Soviet bombs, and Soviet soldiers would be crossing over the Finnish border. But before we go into how this invasion played out, let's talk about the Soviet army. We talked about the Purge last episode, but we're going to go a little bit more into that. Now, as we've already talked about, it had been gutted. Professional military minds are largely dead or dying in Siberia. Then you have people like Grigory Kulik, who kiss ass up the ladder and end up in charge of literally every piece of artillery in the Soviet military. But some Soviet generals did point out that this whole war against Finland might not be as easy as everybody thought it might be. And that was probably the last time they had a chance to raise any criticisms. The Soviet army had just taken over half of Poland with only 1,000 casualties, and they smashed the Japanese army at Kholkhin Gol in Mongolia only a few months before. The problem was Poland was split in half between Soviet and Nazi forces, and the whole thing kind of happened so quickly that they didn't end up fighting any kind of organized resistance. It was all confusion until it was dark. And the Japanese, the victory over the Japanese at Kholkhin Gol was generally a crushing victory over they were fighting a Japanese army that was used to just crushing victories over untrained Chinese conscripts. Right. So like when they fought another military that was even as out of date as the Soviets, they got their fucking asses kicked. Which is the same reason why that like when World War II started, Japan's army was pretty much just a series of failure all the way until they got nuked. Yeah. The Soviet generals brought this problem up. There's a general named Shaposhashkinov that submitted a report to the to the Soviet forces should conduct a methodical buildup. Obviously, they weren't worried about any kind of Finnish counterattack or invasion of the Soviet Union. It simply wasn't going to happen. But what his plan was, let's treat this like an actual war. Let's bring in all these elite forces from all over the Soviet Union.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it takes a long time because it's a fucking war that involves literally hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
Stalin dismissed this immediately. This wasn't because he didn't like the man. He actually did like Shapskinov, which was one of the only reasons why the man was still alive. And Stalin actually kept a copy of his book, The Brain of the Army, on his desk. Like, Stalin thought highly of this guy, but not highly enough, apparently. Like, his Shapskinov's book, The Brain of the Army, is quite literally was taught as Soviet doctrine for decades.
That's cool.
So he knew his shit. I mean, say what you will about Soviet doctrine. It won World War II for the large part.
So his book did better than yours.
Yeah, my book has yet to win any wars.
Okay.
Much like true. Any American general currently serving in the United States Army. Now, it's weird that Stalin, obviously respected this guy, but, not so much. Like, I only respect you enough to let you hang around in your dress uniform. I don't actually want you to open your fucking mouth.
That's why you don't come to the apartment.
Yeah. This is only for bros.
Yeah.
He kept his book on his desk, but Stalin thought that the plan would take too long.
I feel like he never read the book.
Probably not.
He just had it there.
I don't feel like Stalin was a guy who read an awful lot, because when you read, you come upon ideas that are different from your own.
Yeah.
And that's
I feel like he just did a quick little flip, done.
I feel like the last thing Stalin read was something by Lenin before he died and he took over the Soviet Union. So he's not reading. He's not a theory guy.
Unless I wrote the book myself.
Yeah, Stalin's book is just pictures of Stalin staring fiercely at you, and you have to just nod along.
Oh, this is a good part.
Yeah. But now there is one guy that Stalin did listen to, and that is pretty much deathly loyal Stalinist, a guy named Zhedov, who was the political boss in Leningrad. He was not a military officer. Important to point out. Though he would be
There's a lot of these guys running around.
He would end up in charge of the military.
There's a lot of those guys running around, too.
Yeah. So Zhedov convinced Stalin that the military district around Leningrad, which had about 150,000 troops, some tanks, artillery, stuff like that, that enough could be enough. That would be enough to win this war. Like, you just send in the Leningrad soldiers.
Okay.
Yeah. Another problem with the planning process was the inclusion of political officers, which are popularly known as commissars. You might know them from Warhammer 40K.
Yes.
Now, we already did talk about the commissars and barrier troops and stuff like that in a previous episode of Pavlov's house. We were not going to go into that too much more. Just know that commissars had a lot of fucking power. So dissatisfaction with war planning would be thought as disloyalty. And so if you were like, I don't really like these plans, even if like you're going to do normal soldier complaining,
Yeah.
like these orders are kind of dumb. You're going to do them anyway, but you're going to bitch about them the whole time.
Yeah, exactly.
That was not allowed. You'd go to a camp.
Oh,
Yeah.
not a fun camp.
No. You would probably see like a fucking drunk NKVD officer who'd probably shoot you behind the head with a pistol. It's like there's a common disconnection in the popular narrative when it comes to political officers and commissaries. It was like, oh, the commissar will just take you out back and shoot you. That's very rarely the commissars. They would arrest you and take you to the NKVD, which would then execute you.
Yeah.
It's different. Same, but different.
Yeah, same.
So, for instance, when Kulik submitted his plans for the war and was procuring ammunition for his artillery, remember, Kulik is also a gutless yes-man, which is kind of interesting here. He had to go through the chief of logistics, a guy named Voronov. When Kulik said that he only needed enough artillery shells for 12 days, Voronov laughed at his plans and said, because Voronov had been familiar with the Finnish countryside. And it's important to be kind of familiar with the Finnish landscape for this whole war to make sense, in that
it's a little snowy.
It should be just as formidable to invade as Russia itself. Like, everybody says, oh, Mother Winter, like, Finland will fucking kill you. Like, you'll drown in a swamp or freeze to death. Yeah. But Voronov laughed, being very familiar with Finland, and said that if he was going to invade Finland, he would need ammunition for at least 2 to 3 months. Kulik, a deputy commissar with no military training and only sent to his rank due to party loyalties, said that Voronov should base all ammunition and supplies on the 12-day timetable that he had supplied and nothing else. And thus, that is how it was done.
Wow.
Like, it wasn't... It's hard, because, like, sometimes when I'm reading the book Frozen Hell, it kind of makes it sometimes seem like that the military officers come up with a plan, and then the commissars are like, that's a good idea, we should do that. And they, like, kind of meet in the middle, but that's not how it worked. A military officer would have a plan, and the commissar would go, no, let's do this instead. And then they went with the commissar's plan.
Oh, great idea. It's not like mine was planned.
It's like the joke about marriage is like, my wife wanted a puppy, and I didn't want a puppy, so we compromised and got a puppy.
Yeah.
It's that, but with you're going to die.
Okay.
Yeah. The Soviets also had an obsession, as a lot of people did at the time, with the Nazi tactic of blitzkrieg that had stormed across Europe at that point. Now, we know that a lot of blitzkrieg successes were due to luck and beating up on unprepared enemies, but there was some legitimate, revolutionary tactics there, the combined arms stuff. And as Tom pointed out, seemingly forever ago in our German tank episode, the idea of combined arms warfare was absolutely nothing new, and it had existed since the first time a cave person chucked a rock at somebody else while their friend was also trying to stab them with a stick. The Germans simply made it work better. And, I mean, sometimes that's all innovation is.
Right.
However, the German tactics only worked in certain areas, as we saw. The fast-moving armored column swept through parts of Europe with modern rail and road systems. It also benefited from knowing where the enemy's hubs of communication, resupply, and deployment were. It gave them something to target.
Right.
But the main thing the German army benefited from was good communication and the ability to give frontline commanders initiative to do what they thought was necessary on the fly. Small unit leadership.
Yeah.
Things that are all familiar to anybody, familiar at all with how really any modern-day military works. Now, instead of making jokes here, I'm going to quote directly from Frozen Hell, because he does a pretty good job at just roasting the Soviet military. Quote, "The Blitzkrieg, in short, had been perfected for a sleek, hard-muscled, well-trained, and motivated army such as the German General Staff had fashioned during the decades between the wars. It was unsuited for a ponderous, top-heavy army of badly trained soldiers with timid officers, overseen by inexperienced party ideologues, and sent forth to conquer a country whose terrain consists of practically nothing but natural barriers to military operations."
Nice.
Yep. So it's like, have you ever met anybody who's like really wants to do DIY stuff? Like they want to upgrade their house, but they have no idea how to do construction.
Yes.
That's the Soviets in Blitzkrieg.
That was the dude.
We bought all the tools, though.
That was the dude that lived at the house that I'm currently at. Holy fuck. There's a shit ton of stuff fucked up. Like the sink about to fall out of the wall.
Impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he bought all the tools and watched it on YouTube.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. Now, instead of blitzkrieg, they instead unleashed something that the Red Army of the era is pretty well known for: unguided and badly led human wave attacks with some tanks.
That's all you need.
Yeah, and harkening back to our Soviet-Afghan series, the quality of troops thrown into those human waves attacks varied wildly. Some units had been well trained, but they were the minority. Because remember, the purges did pretty short work of most of the good soldiers.
Yeah, did a number on them.
Most were raw draftees who had never even fired their rifles before, and most of them didn't even know they're invading Finland.
Really?
Like, I don't know. Like,
I mean, it's not surprising.
I mean, it's worth noting. You know, the Soviet Union is a vast fucking country, and it has so many millions of people and of so many different socioeconomic backgrounds. Even though they like to think they created some kind of classless society where everybody was equal, they definitely did not. There was parts of it where people were terribly educated to the point that like a lot of like there was a certain submachine gun that was really, really popular within the Finnish army that the Finns tried to sell to the Soviet Union before the war, way before the war. And one of the reasons that the Soviets turned it down is they thought that their normal draftee would be too dumb to be able to use it.
Oh.
So like they're having the bar is low for what is considered okay to fire a rifle, which is common amongst armies of the time.
Right.
But the Soviets were a little bit worse off. Not to mention they were coming off of, civil war and famine and like uncertain leadership changes.
Soviet.
It wasn't a good time to be a draftee in the Soviet army. I don't know if that was ever a good time to be a draftee in the Soviet army.
It never sounds good.
No. Or a draftee in any army. Yeah.
That's true.
So the invading Soviet forces also had no intelligence. Because remember, the invasion was just kind of a half-assed idea that Stalin shot from the hip one day out of an apartment chase. And like there was no further thought really put into it. Now, the area that they wanted to invade was packed full of swamps and dense forests. It was kind of a place you wanted maps of, so you could carefully route your plan of advance. The forward units did not have any of that. Very few maps were given out, and the ones that did were badly out of date and were of an entirely different part of Finland.
What?
It's like that joke.
That's awesome.
It's like, this is a tourism map, sir. Yeah. You know what they did bring? Trucks of propaganda to include entire formations of brass bands, which is not something I normally think of when I think of the Soviet Union. I feel like that's like some pomp and monarchy type shit. Like, we brought the band with us.
Play our war music.
It's just some guy slapping a potato.
Yeah.
Remember, the Soviets thought this whole war thing was a lark, and it was just going to be a side note to the main game, and that would be standing up a Soviet puppet state in Helsinki and making it part of the Soviet Union. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the future in detail, because it is dumb.
Okay.
Because they did do that, where an attempt was made. It was not a good attempt.
A lot of attempts we're talking about.
Yeah. Now, before we go too much further into the story of the Soviet Union's advance, we have to talk about the army Finland was trotting out to defend its borders.
This is what I want to hear.
And I use the term army very loosely. The Finnish army was
a group?
More like a large collection of dudes with rifles. The Finnish army was lean and understrength due to budget concerns. They were authorized 15 divisions on paper, but only had 10. And those 10 divisions were mostly demobilized, and people just went home. Yep. A full mobilization had never actually been attempted before. So when it came, it was confused and problematic. Nobody really had any idea where to go, and officers didn't know what unit they were in. So when the few officers who did show up ready for duty, it was not uncommon for them to be like, well, you're an officer, you went to the academy, even if you're a lieutenant, you're a battalion commander now. Make it work. And it's simply because they were the first ones to show up. And there was like no unit cohesion. This did later change, and a lot of people end up fighting alongside people from their block or whatever. But like in the very opening salvos of the war, people who had trained with other units and other jobs and like on other equipment were just like, oh, you're with him now.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It was all slapdash.
This is awesome.
There's a very good reason why Mannerheim did not want to fight the Soviet military. He knew how strong they would be. Like even through sheer force of numbers, it wasn't good. But for all of Mannerheim's problems, manpower was the lesser of two evils. Looming over it instead was a crippling shortage of supplies, hardware, weapons, planes, tanks, and everything you need to kill people when they invade your country.
Right. The usual.
Yeah. First of all, I said tanks. Finland didn't have any of those. Not a single one. They did have a couple for training, but they had been broken down.
They were just dead lying.
Yeah, they were just in a fucking parking lot somewhere. Well, the tanks, the concept of tanks was relatively new to the whole war thing, having been trotted out during World War I, and a lot of world powers simply thought they were a lark. They were something to break trench warfare, and they weren't going to have a lot of use. But people still had a lot of them, just in case. And people like the Germans and the French were developing, new tactics for combined arms warfare using fast-moving armor formations. And the Red Army did have a fuckload of tanks.
Yeah.
Finns had none. Not a single one.
Hey, you don't need them.
I mean, the Red Army tanks were incredibly old, but it doesn't matter if you're not fighting any other tanks. Though we would find out that would end up not working so well for them. Furthermore, the Finns and their army had almost no experience training or fighting tanks. Most people had never even fucking seen one in person. So, like,
Imagine there's a lot of people back at that time that have not seen a tank.
Well, I mean, for thousands of people who are supposed to be World War I veterans, you would expect to have a vague familiarization, but those guys are getting older.
I've heard stories.
And some of the officers who did fight in the German Imperial Army during World War I, even though that was decades ago, and those guys were not going to be in the front line anymore. And not to mention, back then, tactics normally fell upon, let's just blow them the fuck up with cannons. Which brings us to another problem. Finland had virtually no anti-tank weapons. Or really any artillery of any kind.
Really?
The few guns that they did have did it all the way back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and literally came out of a museum somewhere.
That's awesome.
They did have some World War I artillery, the French 75s from World War I, but they only had a few of them.
I imagine how they're going to get the ammo for these things since they don't have
it
these
turns
pieces.
A whole lot of people accidentally blowing themselves up in factories trying to get them out of work.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah, they're the munitions side of things, and we don't really talk about a whole lot. But a lot of it's in the opening stages, because eventually ammunition does come pouring in from outside sources, mostly Nazi Germany. But they do steal a lot. That's one thing the Soviets are really good at, is leaving shit behind.
Oh, yeah.
And they also manufacture their own shit. Sometimes it does not work so well. All this is accompanied by a severe lack of ammunition for everything, from artillery to individual rifles. Now, this is because Finland was still largely trying to recover their industry output from the Civil War, as well as suffering the effects from the Great Depression. And when I say Great Depression, I don't mean the American Great Depression. Finland's is a little bit different, but the whole world suffered from it. So, same. There's just happened to be a little different because they're also trying to rebuild
Because of the weather.
Yeah, they're also trying to rebuild their entire country at the time, which made things a little worse. Because while it was very, very poor and people were starving during the Great Depression, they hadn't just ended a civil war.
That's true.
I mean, that was that was like a generation ago for us. So, I always find it kind of hard to explain to our largely American audience how unprepared most places are for an outbreak of war that simply don't have millions of guns and piles of ammunition laying around. But they just didn't. Most people only had 12 rounds to the rifle when it was issued to them.
Jesus.
Yeah, it wasn't good. By the time the war started, the entire country only had enough small arms ammunition for 60 days of fighting, and artillery shells for half of that. And that's only for certain calibers. In comparison, the Soviets could afford to fire more shells of a single caliber on a single day than were contained in the entirety of the Finnish reserves.
That's insane.
Not good.
No, it's not
good. So it should not surprise anybody when I was talking about the lead up of hostilities, where Mannerheim was telling literally anybody who would listen, and also a lot of people who wouldn't, that for the love of God, just give Soviets what they want. Because they want Karelia. Fine, fuck it, give it to them. We'll worry about that later.
Sucks.
It's fucking swamps, man.
Yeah.
It is there's more to it than that, but Mannerheim he didn't want to fight, but it's for a good reason. He knew they were going to lose. Now, that obviously Mannerheim would kind of end up being wrong, but not entirely. But Mannerheim knew his army. At one point during a meeting, he literally stood up and pounded the desk and screamed at the prime minister that, quote, "the army is in no shape to fight," and caused other people to boo him.
I mean, he doesn't seem wrong.
No.
His army looks like shit.
And it really seems like the Finnish cabinet was mostly full of sycophantic yes-men who are nationalists. So, the concept of giving away anything to the Soviets. I'm not dumb. Either was Mannerheim. He was practical. He knew that if the Soviets got what they wanted, they would simply demand more or come in and take the rest of Finland. That was their end goal. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But he thought it would give Finland enough time to build defenses and maybe stockpile some more than fucking a dozen rifle rounds per person.
Yeah.
Maybe, pick the war you're going to fight, not this one that's just going to show up on your front door.
Yeah.
Instead, what happened is he resigned from his post. Now, this is partially upon request from the Prime Minister, declaring that Mannerheim was too timid to be a proper Finn.
Ah,
Yeah. Noted literal Finnish future war hero.
really? Too
Also,
timid.
Mannerheim was a household name at this point already, besides the fact from his post, but from the Civil War. Everybody fucking knew who he was. So, like, saying he was too timid to be a
Yeah.
Finn is like, damn! Mannerheim could have fought it, but he didn't want to work for a government that disregarded literally everything he said. So he's like, fine, fuck it, I'll resign. But that did not mean before his resignation that Mannerheim did not prepare for a coming war. Hence the birth of the Mannerheim Line, a massive defensive line that stretched across the Karelian Isthmus and eventually bore his name. The problem was this line was created throughout the turmoil of post-Civil War Finland, where money was tight and corners were cut. Now, this is... It's hard to explain. When I tell you a named line, you're probably thinking of the Hindenburg Line or the Maginot Line, where they have
I'm
these...
thinking this line's probably awesome.
It's not.
Badass.
It's only cool when you think of it.
It's also a cool name.
It is. Mannerheim's an arguably a fucking sweet name. But it's a defensive line, which I've never really seen before or read before about. And it ends up working better than either one of the lines I just named. So, despite everybody knowing the threat of the newly formed Soviet Union, the first bunkers and lines have been built up of unreinforced concrete, making them pretty useless to anything that isn't just small arms fire.
Right.
Like, a grenade would fuck those up. This was eventually improved upon, but as bunkers became better built, the costs went up. So at the beginning of the war, Finland could only afford about 3 or 4 of them in a year, in an area literally meant to defend
That's not good.
hundreds of miles of territory. But the Finns constantly found ways around these small details. The line was not like the Maginot Line. It wasn't made up of concrete monoliths and huge bunkers. The bunkers were small, and when they ran out of money for concrete and like the rebar to reinforce them, they simply build them out of natural terrain, such as logs and boulders, and cut trenches behind them to make them even bigger.
That's awesome.
Yeah, they literally built a fortress out of nature.
It's a do-it-yourself bunker.
Yeah, and unlike the Maginot Line and the Hindenburg Line, the Mannerheim Line worked, and that's because it had a interesting function. They were realistic.
It had that rustic, outdoorsy look that everybody wants in their kitchen.
Yes. Those other gigantic defensive works that I named, or like the Atlantic Wall in Western Europe or whatever, were all created to repel or stop an invasion. That was not the Mannerheim Line's goal. Instead, it was meant to delay a coming attack and change and bend around, which became known as flexible defense. So it could give way. It was designed to do that.
Nice.
So, like, who gives a shit about building this giant concrete bunker? We just have to retake it anyway.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. That makes lines incredibly hard to snuff out, as there's no easily identifiable strong point or command post. Think of it as like a weird, large-scale, irregular warfare at a national fucking level.
Lincoln log bunkers. That's what I'm thinking.
Oh,
right
put them
now.
back together, boys.
Yeah.
Hup, ho, hup. Now, like, think of it as like if 10 Soviet divisions crashed through the Mannerheim Line, which they did. The flanks of that part of the line would simply fold around it, surround them, snuff them out, and then reform on the line.
Now I imagine the trench is actually going, whoa.
They're on hinges.
Yeah.
Hold on to something, we're swinging around.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to point out that Mannerheim, or nor anybody in the Finnish government, thought Finland standing toe-to-toe or fighting it out against the Red Army and winning was an option that existed. Nobody was that dumb, though some were dumber than others. The entire strategy was to delay the Red Juggernaut in their vastness of the frontier long enough for the rest of the world to get off their ass and come help them. It's the same gambit that Ethiopia played against the Italians. Didn't work out too well for Ethiopia, but you can probably figure out why. Racism. It's racism. Now, the freshness of Western anti-communism was still in their head. After all, most people don't know this, but an international coalition of Western powers actually invaded Russia to aid the whites during the Russian Civil War in a place called Archangel. This included American soldiers.
What?
They didn't stick around for too long because they realized, like, wow, the whites are getting their shit fucked. This is after World War I.
Go.
Yeah. So it was reasonable to think that they'd come to the aid of mostly free democracy under the threat of a Stalinist empire. If that didn't work, they would fuck up the Red Army for so long and so hard that Stalin would eventually come to the table and negotiate again, and they would strike a deal that would save the rest of Finland. They knew they'd have to give some up, but they were going to make them fucking pay for it. If Stalin meant to destroy Finland and subjugate it entirely, which quickly became obvious that was his goal, they would fight until they had a final bullet and one last man. Or in Mannerheim's word, the most honorable annihilation.
That's a nice way to say it.
There was actually a German officer, as a German Nazi officer at the time, because they talked a lot, and they obviously in the continuation war they became allies. That if so they said if Finland stood against the Soviet Empire, there'd be nothing but an honorable note in history. Like, dark.
Yeah.
But the most honorable annihilation is pretty baller.
It is. It sounds really good.
It reminds me of like the general during Bastogne.
Oh yeah.
Who have you surrounded? Nuts.
Yeah.
Like,
I would have just like
sunglasses
my
slide.
dick.
Most honorable annihilation. My dick. Mannerheim throws on sunglasses and fucking Naruto runs out the door.
Yeah.
I just ruined his entire legacy by saying that. No historical character could ever be taken seriously if you think about him Naruto running across the battlefield. Now back to the invasion, because I just ruined enough stuff. As the first bombs fell into Helsinki, Gustav Mannerheim, a man several members of the government thought was afraid of the Russians and untrustworthy, was immediately made the commander-in-chief of the Finnish armed forces, as his resignation had not been formally accepted quite yet. His paperwork was still sitting on the prime minister's desk. Must have been a 4-day weekend, you know? As the bombs fell in the capital of the small nation, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov announced that they were not bombing Helsinki. No. That's not something the Soviet Union does. Instead, they're dropping bread baskets to the starving population of the capital city. Because remember, I told you before, they churned out propaganda showing Finns were barefoot and starving.
Were the bread baskets blowing up?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
They were cluster bombs.
So they weren't being fed?
Nope. The Soviet bombing campaign was also badly planned, as they only used 9 bombers, and they managed to blow up their own embassy.
What?
Which I know, like, targeting technology wasn't fucking great.
No, it wasn't.
But, like, don't bomb this one building.
Yeah. Out of the whole city, they're like, that one.
Now, the Finns, being Finns, jokingly nicknamed these Soviet cluster bombs, which did kill around 100 people during this. They called them Molotov's breadbaskets, a sarcastic nickname that needs to be remembered for the next joke to land.
Oh, okay.
Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers soon surged over the border into Finland, starting in the beginning of the largest embarrassments in Soviet military history, which is saying something.
Saying a lot.
The Soviet military plan called for a swift assault across the Karelian Isthmus. There's several reasons for that. The Soviet forces really brought nothing for them to combat the horrible subarctic winters that punished the area.
It seems like a trend.
Yeah, it's kind of funny seeing it happen to the Soviets, because everybody thinks of, like, General Winter, and, like, it killed Napoleon, it killed Hitler.
Yeah.
Well, the Soviets got it too.
We're a different breed.
It turns out General Winter just kind of shoots in every direction.
Yeah.
He's a fucking wild card.
We're one with winter.
Now, as it was November, it was the beginning of this of what could be considered the cold season in that area, but it wasn't supposed to be that cold. It was an unseasonable early winter, and it shouldn't have been cold enough to start freezing men where they stood, but cold enough to freeze miles of swamps that cover the area. The Soviets knew that, and they were kind of leaning on that pretty hard.
When you say that's not that cold, get fucked.
I mean,
it's cold as shit.
Yeah, but I mean, you're talking about like a subarctic country that people literally freeze to death standing.
That.
Yeah.
I'm from California.
Now, as I said, the Soviets brought no winter uniforms, and then what has to be the biggest case of historical irony I've ever heard, they also brought nobody knowledgeable about how to fight in the snow, because we all need it. We all think about them to be like these goddamn snow warriors that can trudge through anything, wearing like white camouflage, where nobody else thought about that. Well, guess what? They were wearing fucking green.
Yeah. You don't need it.
Yeah. They also brought no like trained ski soldiers, which sounds kind of hilarious, because like when I think of skiing, I think of like downhill skiing.
I was thinking of the douchebags on the movies are mainly skiers. And the good guys are always the snowboarders. Which is why I snowboard.
Well, just think of the Finns as using snowboards throughout the war.
Nice.
Totally radical, bro.
Oh, fuck yeah, dude.
Now,
life jacket.
So, like, there's places where snowbanks will pile up taller than you are. So you can't walk across them.
No.
The only way to make it across them is skiing.
That reminds me of the time where we went, what is it? Sledding? I don't know what we were doing. And we were out in this parking lot.
Yeah.
We were in the parking lot of this giant snowbank, and me and you and our other buddy were going down it.
Yes.
That was a good time.
And when you're standing on the top of it, you sank up to your motherfucking waist.
Yeah, I did.
Now imagine doing that wearing combat kit, and you have to march like 20 fucking miles.
Wearing green.
That's what the Soviets were trying to do, while people were actively trying to kill them. Meanwhile, the Finns, for a lack of most things, they did know how to ski, because otherwise they would have died out there.
Yeah, I imagine they do that everywhere they go.
Yeah, they turned the Karelian Isthmus into the graveyard of tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers pretty rapidly because of this. The Soviets knew they had to act fast, and that's where I defer back to the description of the Blitzkrieg and the weaknesses of the Red Army. Soviet columns of tens of thousands of soldiers were slow to get moving and quickly got lost using their old shitty maps, or their no maps at all. Officers and commissars attempted to fight one another for control of their own military formations. And this is before Finnish resistance showed up. They were already grinding to a halt, fighting themselves.
That's awesome.
And then the Finns showed up. Now, it should be pointed out the first Finns to fight the Soviets were not soldiers. They were a collection of cops and Border Patrol guys. The only cool cops and Border Patrol guys
cool
that ever
ones it
exist.
sounds like.
Yeah. Though oddly, still racist.
Put him in a camp!
Now, they're also pretty scattered, because obviously you can't imagine that these guys are in like a barracks of hundreds of people. So it would be like small groups of like a couple dozen people, or sometimes even a single guy would pop up and harass an entire Soviet division, and then keep them pinned down with scattered rifle fire. Because the Finns had the Soviets had a tendency, when they get shot, they just stop. So the Finns would sometimes just fire around near them, then ski off, and leave them trapped out on the road.
Oh, away I go.
I mean, there were sniper attacks where like one Finnish sniper, and we're not even talking about Simio Haiha yet.
Yeah, that guy's
where
badass.
like he would pin down a Soviet company and like keep them pinned down for so long by himself that he'd kill all their officers and commissars and just walk away. And then the Soviet soldiers have no idea what to do, so they just start walking back the other way. And then the Finns would let them. It's like, no, they're not fighting us anymore.
Yeah, they're just walking by.
Yeah. In the Lake Lagoda route of the advance, the Soviets quickly became stranded. You see, if you look at a map, and I don't have a map handy, but just Google one or something.
I'm pretty sure that's what Finland looks like. It's our whiteboard.
Yeah. The roads didn't exist. The route looks a lot more clear than the Karelian advance. But the isthmus route cut through swamps and waterways. But those were frozen, and so they expected to drive over them. The Lagoda region was seemingly custom built to fuck the Soviets.
Never do I want to hear, hey, we got to drive over it. It's frozen. You'll be fine.
Oh, yeah.
I never want to hear that.
It quickly becomes
Ever.
even worse than you could imagine. So the Lagoda region was mostly barren. The roads that did exist were single-track wagon roads that were unpaved and were normally used by horse and buggies. There would only be about one road for miles and no shelter in any direction, as the area was almost completely devoid of human life. Finnish people didn't even live there.
That place sucks.
The Red Army swarmed these areas with literally thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of men, quickly turning the few roads into like fucking traffic jams with their own people. Crossing through the forest was nearly impossible without trained skiers, as snow drifts would normally pile up to 6 or 7 feet.
Oh.
Once confined to the roads, they became easy targets for Finnish riflemen who could launch hit-and-run attacks on stranded soldiers who had nowhere else to go. Now, and the Finns refused to budge once they had them pinned down. And unlike the badly led and already demoralized Red Army, the average Finn's morale was pretty fucking high for someone fighting these kind of odds. He was defending his homeland. He knew their ancestors had squared off against the Russians so many times that he lost count in the same countryside and won. At most, Finnish army units were recruited and based regionally, making these men literally fighting in their own backyards.
They're also having a blast because they're skiing.
And I mean, like, they're hunting. They're
Not, basically.
They're not even getting shot at, really. The average Finn was a crack shot with his decades-old Mosin Nagant rifle. And hunting and community-based marksman competition were normal. For instance, Simio Haiha had won, like, a fucking 24 goddamn rifle marksmanship competitions before he ever fired a shot in anger.
Wow.
Yeah, like, he was one of the best marksmen in the country before he ever had to shoot a person.
And then he became one of the best snipers.
It was something that the Finns really had well done. Like, they have a small army. They still have a small army. I mean, most people have a small army compared to us. But they train them to shoot competitively rather than, like, just shoot for your marksmanship or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's, like, largely community-based. So, like, every area that draws soldiers from all has a shooting range. So like competitive shooting is pretty deep in this system, and it was then too. Also, other Finnish small arms were superior to their Soviet counterparts, owing to the fact they only had a fraction of soldiers to equip rather than the fucking unknown hordes of the Red Army. They used the Latti's light machine gun, which was it was the first real functional assault rifle. And I'm using that to say that like the Browning automatic rifle is also kind of considered an assault rifle. We're not gun guys. I don't really give a shit. It was the Browning automatic weapon before the Browning automatic weapon existed, and it was better for the most part.
Sounds super familiar.
Yeah, I believe it's in Battlefield 1. I don't remember.
Hey.
As well as the Sumi submachine gun, a gun so terrifyingly adept at churning Soviets to paste that the Red Army eventually copied it, which gave birth to the PPSH burp gun.
The Papasha?
Yeah, that you can thank the Finnish for that. Also, that was one. The Lati was the one they were going to sell to the Soviets, but
wow.
It wasn't the most reliable weapon. Like you had to clean it like a lot. And it had a lot of small parts, so the Soviets like, we're too dumb to figure this out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a long and short of it. It's not the greatest description of why they turned down, but mostly it came down to like our conscripts won't be able to figure this out.
They're too stupid. They're
kind
simple.
of. I mean, that's not the first time armies have turned stuff down like that.
Oh, no, I totally believe it.
There was armies that turned down the Garand because of that. Stuff like that. So
it's not even complicated. Oh, I'd say that out of being around it for a while.
Yeah,
learning about it.
When you first used it, it was fucking generations old already.
Fucking badass.
Now, whereas the Red Army thought the Finns were starving and oppressed people waiting for liberation, as that is what they've been told.
Do you have bread baskets?
We have plenty of bread baskets now. The Finns knew their enemy was better armed and outnumbered them by millions. So they had the right mindset going into it. While the Red Army stomped into Finland thinking this is going to be a pushover, the Finns are like, I'm probably going to lose. You know, it's a mentality thing.
Yeah.
A common joke by Finnish soldiers during the war were, quote, "There are so many. Our country is so small. Where will we find room to bury them all?"
That's fucking awesome. That is metal as fuck, dude.
And that joke would become a cold reality for thousands of Soviet troops.
It sounds like a little Finnish girl probably said that, and the general's like, "It's pretty fucking badass, little girl."
Promote that woman to general.
Yeah.
And that is where we'll pick up next week.
Daddy, where will we bury them all?
Where will we find room for all these dead people? We'll eat them, daughter. We'll eat them. So that is part 2 of our Winter War series. I do not know how long it's going to be. I'm going to try to keep it.
It's fucking badass already.
This will be the first war that we're going to cover that the series is almost as long as the war itself. So that's fun.
I like this a lot.
So if you like our show and you think it's worth $1, you can give it to us on Patreon. Our show will always be free, but your contributions help us greatly. You can get free bonus episodes, you get stickers, you get books, you get episodes early, and you get our communal Discord that we share at the Hell of a Way to Die. If you don't want to do that, that is perfectly fine. Just like, share, and review our shit and help us crawl up the iTunes rankings because that sort of thing always helps. We also have a Teespring store full of professionally designed and unprofessionally designed shirts, and you can buy one of those.
Sweet.
So thank you for tuning in, and we will talk to you next week.
Later.